Professor of Atmospheric Science, Dr. Michael Mann.
Thanks so much, Paul. Let's get that situated. It's a real pleasure to be here with you all today. As Paul mentioned, he and I literally go back to the first grade. We were in first grade together, and it's been a pleasure to continue to to keep in touch with Paul over the years. And when he invited me up here a year ago, and again this year, to talk about this issue of climate change, I was, of course, very pleased to do that. This is sort of my home. I grew up here in Western Massachusetts. And in fact, I think Taconic, I think we used to face you guys in cross-country matches and usually lose to you. As I recall, Taconic had a great cross-country team. So this is sort of a second home to me. I'm glad we got through the technical glitches. I was a little concerned about giving a talk on Friday the 13th, but fortunately we did get the technical issues sorted out. So I'm going to talk to you today about the issue of human-caused climate change, but from perhaps a slightly different perspective from the one that you're used to seeing. Literally, I am going to use cartoons to tell this story from the basic science. In fact, how does science work? The first chapter of our book, The Madhouse Effect. You know, how does science work versus how is science litigated in the public sphere? What is the evidence for climate change? What are the impacts? And what about the politics surrounding this issue, and how do we get past this impasse that we find ourselves in? We published The Madhouse Effect a year and a half ago before the presidential election, and in some ways, the book sort of presaged the era that we're now in, because of course at a time when we thought we were moving on from confronting outright denialism of climate change in our highest levels of government, we now have for the first time a chief executive who does dismiss the science of climate change, dismisses it as a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese. So I'm going to title this The Madhouse Effect, a post-election climate change update, or alternatively you could subtitle this Climate Denial in the Era of Trump. So first of all, how does science work? Skepticism is actually a very important thing. It's a good thing in science. It's what the great Carl Sagan described as the self-correcting machinery that keeps science on a path toward a better understanding of the way our natural world works. But too often we find individuals who present themselves as if they are modern-day Galileos, railing against the scientific establishment, when in fact they are nothing of the sort. And in this regard, I like to quote Carl Sagan, again, the great Carl Sagan: "The fact that some geniuses were laughed at does not imply that all who are laughed at are geniuses. They laughed at Columbus. They laughed at Fulton. They laughed at the Wright brothers, but they also laughed at Bozo the Clown." And some of you in the audience are old enough to remember, I remember watching Bozo the Clown. And so for every Galileo, there are thousands of pretenders, cranks dressed up as Galileo, if you will. And too often they have the megaphone. They have an echo chamber there to trumpet their views in a way that pollutes our public discourse. And that brings us to sort of a pet peeve of many of us who are trying to communicate the science and its implications to the public. Too often we encounter this problem that we call false balance, where the media treats the science of climate change as if it's a debate between two equal sides, when in fact the overwhelming majority of scientists, the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, every scientific society in the United States or in Europe, around the world that's weighed in on this matter, has concluded that climate change is real, it's caused by us, and it's already a problem. And yet too often in our media, it's treated as if there are two sides that deserve an equal say in our public discourse. And even the New York Times has hired an opinion writer, for example, who presents contrarian views on again, the overwhelming consensus of human-caused climate change. And what the critics will often point to, they'll say, well, there's uncertainty. There's uncertainty in the science, so why should we act? And there is uncertainty. There is uncertainty. We're not 100% certain of the science, and we never will be. There are uncertainties in the science of gravity. We've never measured a graviton, the fundamental unit of gravity. So you could say there are fundamental uncertainties in the theory of gravity. We only, within the last couple years, observed gravitational waves, which were a predicted consequence of Einstein's theory of gravitation. So you could say there are uncertainties in gravity. We don't understand every detail, just like we don't understand every detail of climate change. But that doesn't make it safe to walk off a cliff. And yet there are those who would have us walk off the metaphorical cliff of not acting on climate change, given similar levels of certainty in our science. In that regard, let me quote the great Stephen Hawking, who passed away some weeks ago, one of the most brilliant scientists of our era. He didn't really suffer climate change deniers very well. Next time, he said, next time you meet a climate change denier, tell them to take a trip to Venus. I will pay the fare. And of course, Venus is an example of what happens with a runaway greenhouse effect. And if we didn't understand the reality and the warming effect of the greenhouse effect, we wouldn't be able to explain why Venus is as hot as it is. And that's the point he was making. It's really silly to deny the basic science here. Another pet peeve of mine is the way that we often, again in the public sphere, we often find issues like the impact of climate change on extreme weather events, the framing that we find in discussions, in media discussions of that connection. And it is true that, as the cartoon conveys here, you can't prove that any one storm was caused by climate change, but it's an answer to the wrong question. The question isn't, did climate change cause this event? The question is climate change exacerbating these events? The baseball player who's been taking steroids all summer, who's been taking steroids and breaks the all-time record for home runs that season, would it be an excuse for him to say, you can't prove that the steroids caused any one of those specific home runs that I hit? Well, that's a technicality, again, that, as Tom says here in the small print, with the Tom Towles cartoons. Tom Towles, of course, is my co-author of the Madhouse Effect. He's the cartoonist for the Washington Post. Many of you will recognize these square cartoons. And there's always a little guy down in the corner. That's actually Tom himself at his artist desk. And he's always saying something pithy there. So you want to read that fine print. And as he points out, this is a loophole through which you could lose a planet. What is the evidence? Well, we had Hurricane Harvey last season, and by the way, the hurricane season is going to be underway in less than 2 months now, the next hurricane season. The last hurricane season, Harvey was the biggest flooding event on record for the United States. And part of why that happened was that those sea surface temperatures in the Gulf of Mexico were at unusual levels of warmth. And the warmer those sea surface temperatures are, the more moisture there is in the atmosphere. And somebody who denies that is not denying climate change, they're denying physics. Because that's actually simple thermodynamics. A warmer ocean is going to evaporate more moisture into the atmosphere. And that means there's more moisture to turn into record flooding rains or snowfalls. And Harvey was testament to that. Then, of course, we had Irma, which was the strongest storm ever, as measured by peak winds in the open Atlantic. And you might say, well, okay, so it's a coincidence. It's a coincidence that global surface temperatures and Atlantic surface temperatures have been at all-time highs for the last few years. Coincidence that, again, the basic physics tells us that the warmer the ocean surface, the more energy there is to intensify these storms. It turns out by somewhere in the range of 10 miles per hour for each degree Fahrenheit warming of the ocean surface. So maybe it's a coincidence that Irma was the strongest storm on record in the open Atlantic, or that during the past few years we've seen the strongest storm ever globally. That was Patricia in the Pacific, as measured by peak winds. Strongest storm, obviously, in the northern hemisphere, but we also got the strongest storm ever in the southern hemisphere, Winston, which made landfall on Fiji and did tremendous damage. So the Pacific, the Atlantic, the northern hemisphere, the southern hemisphere, the globe, the strongest storms on record within the past few years, during which sea surface temperatures have been at all-time records, and where the basic physics of it tells us that we expect stronger storms. How much stronger? I said about 10 miles per hour for each degree Fahrenheit warming of the ocean. The oceans have warmed more than a degree Fahrenheit, so that 10 miles per hour is a roughly 7% increase in the wind speeds of these Cat 4 and Cat 5 hurricanes. That might not sound like a huge effect, but you have to take into account the fact that the destructive potential of a hurricane goes as the third power of the wind speed. The actual destructive, the power that's dissipated by those storms on the surface, on when it makes landfall, on structures, on people, goes as the third power of that wind speed. So that 7% increase in wind speed becomes a roughly 20% increase in the destructive potential of these storms. That's not a subtle effect. That's something that you will see. That's something that you see, and we've seen that in the data on our television screens as it's playing out, as was the case with Irma, which did tremendous damage in parts of the Caribbean, southern Florida, the Keys, and then, of course, we had Maria, which was a similarly strong monster storm in the Atlantic that took a devastating toll on Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico still hasn't recovered. There are still people without fresh water and power in Puerto Rico because of this unprecedented storm. So can we prove that Maria was caused by climate change, that Irma was caused by climate change, that Harvey was caused by climate change? No, we can't literally conclude that they were caused by climate change. That's a loophole, again, you could lose a planet through. The relevant fact here is that these storms have been made more intense, more destructive, and they produce more flooding rains because of the warming of the planet. So why should we give a damn? This is the next chapter in the book. It isn't just about polar bears and penguins. It is partly about polar bears and penguins. To me, I care about the world that we're leaving behind for my daughter, for our children, for our grandchildren. I care about the potential for them not to be able to experience the beauty and wonder of this planet that I was able to experience. I think that has deep ethical implications. And so it is about what these creatures symbolically represent. But more tangibly, it's about record drought in California, the worst drought in at least 1,200 years. And the critics will say, well, maybe that's just a coincidence. Maybe it's a coincidence that our models predicted worse drought in subtropical regions like California. We're now experiencing the worst drought on record, or have experienced over the better part of the last decade, worst drought on record in California, when soil temperatures have been unusually warm, evaporating more moisture into the atmosphere, less snowpack because of those warm winters, less spring runoff of water that California relies upon, and the storms have been veering north of California by an unusual jet stream pattern that we increasingly think has to do with the impact of climate change. So maybe it's a coincidence, but I don't think it is. And it isn't just California, it's other regions in the subtropics like Syria. Syria has had the worst drought, the tree ring, people tell us, in at least 900 years. That doesn't mean there was a worse drought 900 years ago in Syria. That's just as far back as they can go. As far back as they can go, the drought in Syria is the worst drought on record. And what did that drought do? It drove rural farmers into the cities where they were now competing for food and water and space with the existing population, exacerbating tensions over access to resources, creating conflict, creating an environment in which a terrorist organization like ISIS could arise. So when our president says we shouldn't worry about climate change, we should worry about more immediate issues like ISIS and international terrorism, there's a deep fallacy in that sort of reasoning because, in fact, these national security threats are linked to climate change. Our national security leaders consider climate change to be a threat multiplier. It takes existing tensions and it exacerbates them. And we're paying the price now in terms of conflicts around the world. So it's about conflict, it's about national security, it's about civilization, unprecedented wildfires that are destroying large parts of the West, a threefold increase over the past few decades, warmer and drier summers, warmer winters, which allows pests like the pine bark beetle to infest the forests and weaken them so that when you get those dry and hot summers, you get massive forest fires. California had the worst wildfire this last year on record, the Thomas Fire, now California's largest wildfire in history, and it happened at the wrong time. You're not supposed to get wildfires in California during the winter, but this did happen during the winter. And why is that? The dry season is expanding, the season during which temperatures are high, soil is dry, is extending increasingly into the winter, and that was the worst fire that we've seen on record. In fact, it actually damaged Rupert Murdoch's estate. Rupert Murdoch, as you may know, is the CEO of News Corp, a media mogul who owns Fox News and the Wall Street Journal editorial pages, and various tabloids around the country that have been paramount in polluting the public discourse over human-caused climate change, purveyors of climate change denialism. But you know, when it strikes home, maybe that gets you to rethink your position, and it literally struck home for Rupert Murdoch with that fire. Now, that massive wildfire weakened the soils, it destroyed large amounts of vegetation, so that when California finally got those storms in the winter, which it will get, you do continue to get storms. They may get less rainfall, but when it does rain, you get more of it at one time, and that's because a warmer atmosphere, again, can hold more moisture. So when conditions are conducive to getting rainfall, you get more of it over a short period of time. And so you had that soil that had sort of lost its integrity from these wildfires. Finally, the rains come, and you get these terrible mudslides that took a human toll, at least 18 lives. And that's a reminder of some of the subtleties about the way climate change can impact us in sometimes what might have seemed unpredictable ways. Those wildfires actually created the conditions necessary for these terrible mudslides in the winter. So there is still this continued effort in the era of Trump for some of our, elected officials to essentially do the bidding of fossil fuel interests who fund their campaigns and deny the overwhelming science of climate change. And often this takes various stages. The first stage of denial, if you will, it's not happening. How many people in this room have heard the claim that global warming has stopped, that there was a hiatus or a slowdown? This is a widespread myth that has been perpetuated by climate change contrarians. Well, what does the data actually say? 2014 was the warmest year on record globally until 2015, which was the warmest year on record, until 2016, which was the warmest year on record. Good news, 2017, not the warmest year on record. It was only the second warmest year on record. Well, maybe those consecutive record-breaking years, maybe that was natural. The warming up of the water that these poor frogs find themselves in, stovetop temperatures change all the time. Who's to say that there's a problem here? Well, actually, you can address that scientifically. We published a study a year ago looking at the likelihood that we would have seen 3 consecutive record-breaking years, 2014, 2015, 2016, in the absence of climate change. And we found that it was quite low. I could read you the abstract and talk about some of the technical details of the study, but suffice it to put up this headline that appeared in Discover magazine that I think summarized our conclusions most aptly here. Oops, didn't mean to do that. The record global warming streak of 2014 through 2016, a snowball's chance in hell that this was natural, which is the technical description, of course, for our finding. Well, we do have senators like James Inhofe who believe that snowfall in Washington, D.C. in the winter and introducing a snowball on the Senate floor somehow disputes 200 years of basic science, physics, chemistry, and of course it doesn't. In fact, ironically, as I alluded to earlier, Washington, D.C. may see heavier snowfalls because of warming Atlantic Ocean temperatures. There's more moisture in the air when you get one of those nor'easters, and we've seen quite a few nor'easters this season up here in the northeastern U.S. Those nor'easters are actually getting more powerful because they're in part driven by the warmth from the ocean surface. That makes them a little different from a typical mid-latitude storm. They're getting stronger. The science tells us that we can expect them to get stronger for the same reasons that hurricanes are getting stronger. More moisture in the atmosphere, well, it's going to be cold enough that that moisture isn't going to fall as rain. It's going to fall as snow. And so we've gotten record snowfalls along the eastern U.S. That may actually be symptomatic of climate change. Hardly evidence against it. The season of snow cover will shrink. The winters will get shorter, but the individual snowfall events will likely become greater along the east coast of the U.S. The next stage of denial then is, okay, well, it's self-correcting after all. We don't have to worry, it'll correct itself. And unless what you mean by that is that hundreds of feet of global sea level rise will snuff out all of our coal-fired power plants, no, it's not reasonable to say that this problem is self-correcting. We can reestablish the warmth of the early Cretaceous period. The high school students in the audience, about 100 million years ago when dinosaurs roamed the planet, you may have studied that period in school, CO2 levels in the atmosphere were high for natural reasons. Over hundreds of millions of years, the concentrations of greenhouse gases vary naturally. What we've done is we've taken all that carbon that existed during the early Cretaceous period, nature slowly buried it beneath the Earth's surface. Over that 100 million years, what have we been doing? We've been unburying it and putting it back into the atmosphere 1 million times faster over a time scale, not of 100 million years, but 100 years. So unless you mean that, that is self-correcting, it's not. And a related then stage of denial, sort of the next logical stage of denial is, well, in any case, it's a good thing after all. And you might think, well, that's silly. I mean, nobody would actually try to say that global warming is a good thing. Scott Pruitt said exactly that. You may have seen some of the headlines a few weeks ago where Pruitt, the EPA administrator, who has very close ties to the Koch brothers, the largest polluting interest in the country, and has been advancing an agenda of deregulation, environmental deregulation over the past over the past year, was making the rounds on the talk show circuit, talking about how global warming isn't necessarily a bad thing. It will help humans flourish. Actually, global warming is good. EPA Chief Scott Pruitt, global warming may be a good thing. So yes, there are people who are literally saying that it's a good thing at the highest levels of government today. And Scott Pruitt has encountered some other problems in recent weeks, as you may have read about, but ethical lapses during his tenure as EPA administrator. But the greatest ethical lapse, of course, that he's guilty of is trying to dismantle a half-century of environmental protections that were put in place by Republican and Democratic administrations alike. And that's important to keep in mind. Many of the major environmental successes of the past half century came under Republican administrations, Nixon, Reagan, both Bushes. And the Trump administration is dismantling environmental protections that they put in place. So this isn't even a partisan thing anymore. Or at least it's consistent with hyper partisanship, where, you know, our environmental protection, which you would think of as a matter of being, you know, conservativeness, conserving. You would think stewardship and environmental protection would be part of that. But of course, that isn't the position of the current sort of prevailing ethos in the Republican Party. So unless you think that massive wildfires and floods and heat waves and superstorms are a good thing, no, it's not a good thing. The final stage of denial, of course, it's too late to do anything about it anyway. And that isn't true either. The good news is that that simply isn't true. We published an article a couple weeks ago, though, in the journal Nature Geoscience, showing that there is great urgency. If we're going to avoid warming the planet by more than 2 degrees Celsius, 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit relative to the pre-industrial period, which many scientists who've studied the impacts of climate change will tell you that's where we really get into the most dangerous and potentially irreversible climate change impacts. If we are going to do that, we have to act now. There is no time for further delay. At a time when, again, we're seeing a move away from decarbonizing our economy within the federal government, we actually have to be putting our foot on the veritable pedal of decarbonizing even faster. So there is still time. The war on climate science, so the denial of climate change is part of this ongoing war on climate science. Where vested interests, powerful vested interests, fossil fuel supported front groups and think tanks and individuals, even scientists with impressive credentials who have served as willing spokespeople for the fossil fuel industry in attacking the overwhelming consensus of human-caused climate change. They're part of this war on climate science, and you know, as long as there are fossil fuels to burn, there will be people denying climate change, just like there's still a soldier found fighting World War II, still fighting World War II a few years ago. As long as there are fossil fuels to burn, we will have talking heads, paid advocates for the fossil fuel industry denying the science of climate change. But they will become as irrelevant as the last soldier still fighting World War II. We will move on. We're not going to win over 100% of the public. We never have on any issue. But there will be a governing majority for progress. And part of why I'm optimistic about that, by the way, is because of high school age students and the cultural tipping point that we are going through right now in the way that we look at sort of common sense gun laws. We're seeing something we haven't seen in a long time, young people seizing the narrative and drawing upon the just the profound moral authority that they have, speaking truth to power. And we're going through that tipping point right now, a cultural tipping point. And if we can do it on guns, if we can do it on marriage equality, which we did a few years ago, and we can do it on guns, we can do it on environmental preservation and climate change as well. And so much of my optimism comes from you folks in the front few rows here, high school students who are now speaking out and demanding that those in positions of authority act on our behalf and not the special interests that may be funding their campaigns. And of course, we have a midterm election in less than 300 days where we can decide to move in a different direction. I'll come back to that. So in this war on climate change, there is no, there really is, there is endless hypocrisy to be seen among climate change deniers. Ken Cuccinelli, the Attorney General of Virginia, some years ago, attempted to subpoena all of my personal emails from the time I was a faculty member at the University of Virginia. His campaign had been supported mostly by fossil fuel interests, and in doing their bidding, he wanted to subpoena my emails. Does this sound familiar? Getting a hold of emails so you can go through them and look for something to use to try to misrepresent, to embarrass, to discredit a messenger. And that's what he was attempting to do. This was denounced by academics and scientists around the country, in fact, as a transparent effort to intimidate scientists whose research might be a threat to the vested interests that fund his campaigns. And the Washington Post published no less than 5 editorials denouncing Ken Cuccinelli's witch hunt against me and the University of Virginia. And their award-winning cartoonist, Tom Towles, weighed in, Pulitzer Prize-winning cartoonist, Tom Towles, weighed in on the matter, not once, but twice. And I have to admit that is my favorite here. It's Ken Cuccinelli up in the judge's chair here, and poor Galileo down below. He wants to see his emails too. I don't mind being compared to Galileo, I suppose. So turns out Ken Cuccinelli was unsuccessful in this effort. His subpoena was quashed by the court on a technicality. In his 40-plus page filing to the court, he had failed to provide evidence of wrongdoing on my part. And so the court threw it out. He appealed to the state Supreme Court, which ultimately ruled against the case with prejudice, meaning they never want to see an attorney general come back to the court with something like this again. So we prevailed in that battle. But Ken Cuccinelli went on to run for governor of the state of Virginia. And as you can see here, I actively campaigned with his opponent, Terry McAuliffe, because I understood the threat of having as a governor of the great Commonwealth of Virginia somebody who has antipathy towards science, science that might be inconvenient to him and the special interests that he represents, rather than seeing science as a major contributor to progress and to our economy. And that contrast was drawn out in this campaign. McAuliffe was successful. He prevailed in that race. Ken Cuccinelli went off to work with an oyster farm on Tangier Island. This is an island in the Chesapeake Bay that's slowly succumbing to the effects of global sea level rise. And you can't make this stuff up. I mean, this actually happened. And it really does drive home the fact that, yes, hypocrisy, thy name is climate change denial. If we can get past denialism, and we are getting past it, despite having a president and a Congress that is still on the wrong side of this issue, we're seeing progress. But some have argued that the solution to this problem is actually what we call geoengineering. Essentially, we can continue to burn carbon and elevate the concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere, but we will engage in some other planetary scale intervention with the climate, with this system we don't understand perfectly. We'll shoot particles into the stratosphere. We will dump particles into the oceans. We'll put reflecting mirrors in space. And maybe, if we get really lucky, it'll magically work out and it'll offset the effect of the carbon we're adding to the atmosphere. But more likely, and there is now much research to suggest this, there would likely be all sorts of unintended consequences. For example, the pattern of cooling from putting those particles into the stratosphere doesn't look like the spatial global pattern of warming from greenhouse gases. So in the global average, you might offset the warming, but at the expense of some areas cooling and other areas warming even faster. And yes, Greenland could warm even faster. We could melt the Greenland ice sheet even faster. So most of these schemes come, again, with the principle of unintended consequences, and you would think that they would not be held out as serious policy prescriptions for how we should deal with the climate change challenge. And yet that is, for example, the position of our former Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, who happens to be the former CEO of the world's largest fossil fuel company, ExxonMobil. You might think that he might have sort of some interest in the idea that we can continue to burn fossil fuels, but we'll find some technical fix to offset that. Of course, Rex Tillerson is no longer Secretary of State. But there are many others who are advocating for geoengineering as the solution to the problem. And When sort of summarizing my position on climate change, on geoengineering, I sometimes like to draw upon a song that many of us grew up with, and I think even kids today still grow up with this song. There was an old lady who swallowed a fly, and she swallowed the frog to swallow the fly, and on it goes until she swallowed a horse. And she died, of course. And it wasn't the fly that killed her, it was the horse. So geoengineering, it may not even be the initial problem that we're trying to solve, but the attempt to offset it through unprecedented and uncontrolled planetary scale interventions, it could leave us worse off than when we started. So the real solution, of course, is solving this problem at its root cause, preventing the continued accumulation of carbon in the atmosphere. That's the path forward. And we've seen, despite some of the challenges we've seen in recent years, we've seen some important positive developments. Pope Francis sort of lending his authority as the Pope, as someone who speaks to more than a billion people around the planet who are Catholic, and many more billions of people who, whether they're Catholic or not, respect the moral authority with which Francis speaks. And he has lent that moral authority to raising awareness about what he sees as a threat to creation. And whether you come at this from the standpoint of a person of faith who sees this as a matter of our stewardship to the earth, or as a father who sees this as a matter of preserving the planet for his daughter and her children and her grandchildren, whether you come at this from a position of faith or simply intergenerational ethics, I think we can all agree that climate change isn't just about science, it isn't just about economics or policy or politics, it's about ethics. Do we want to be responsible for degrading our planet for future generations? Do we want to look back and see that as our legacy? I don't think so. And we have seen global cooperation, the Paris Agreement, this monumental agreement where every country of the world now, with one exception, technically speaking, Donald Trump has threatened to pull out of Paris. And despite that, even if Trump were to pull out of Paris, we would still, if you look at the progress that's taking place at the state level, at the municipal level, the New England states, including Massachusetts, are part of a regional consortium to price carbon and incentivize renewable energy. The West Coast states are as well. Virginia has joined in. New Jersey has joined in. Nearly a third of the population of this country lives in a state that is acting on climate change. Many of our largest cities and our largest companies are committed to the Paris Agreement. And so even if Trump does pull out, apparently he's had some trouble with pulling out recently, even if he is to pull out of Paris, we will still likely meet our obligations under the Paris Agreement. We have come up against this wall. It's not the physical wall that Trump is threatening to build. It's this metaphorical wall that stands between him and the overwhelming evidence of climate change. And that, is something that, as we allude to here, we will all pay for, if indeed he is successful in that effort. And we have seen under the Trump administration an effort to roll back the progress of the previous administration and indeed the environmental progress of several previous administrations, Republican and Democratic, the threat to pull out of the Paris Agreement, as I already mentioned, which before he sadly passed away, Stephen Hawking weighed in on this. And what he said was, by denying the evidence for climate change and pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement, Donald Trump will cause avoidable environmental damage to our beautiful planet, endangering the natural world for us and our children. And I don't think a more eloquent statement can be found than Stephen Hawking's statement before he passed away about, again, the ethical the ethical dilemma of not acting on this crisis while we still can. And it is, of course, it isn't just Donald Trump, but it's the people that he has appointed to positions of leadership in his administration, a veritable dream team, as I sometimes refer to it, of climate change deniers and fossil fuel lobbyists, including Scott Pruitt, we already mentioned, Rick Perry, who, as we know, would get rid of the department that he heads up, the Department of Energy, if he could remember it. And so we've seen efforts at EPA, at the Department of Interior, Ryan Zinke, to roll back the progress that we've made in acting on climate change at the level of our executive. And they've had some assistance among congressional Republicans who are also in denial of climate change, who've looked the other way, who have facilitated this war on the environment that's taking place within the current administration. One of them, Lamar Smith, he's stepping down, a congressman from Texas. He is the chair of the House Science Committee. He's decided to not run again in this next election, one of a large number of Republican congresspeople who have recently announced they won't run again. Fearing not being, I suppose, flooded by those unprecedented rains of Harvey, but this blue wave that is supposedly cresting as we go into the midterm elections. So he's stepping down, but he is still currently the chair of the House Science Committee and has used that position to attack the science of climate change, to actually go after climate scientists with subpoenas and trying to defund support for climate change within our various government administrations, the NSF, NASA, NOAA. I testified to a hearing that he held on the science of climate change some months ago, actually a year ago now, and I was the only mainstream climate scientist. He had invited 3 contrarians to testify on the same day, and I think that was unfair. It's an unfair fight to have one mainstream scientist and 3 contrarians, because it wouldn't matter if they had 1,000 contrarians. The science is on our side, the evidence is on our side, and increasingly the public is on our side as well. And I think we are seeing a marginalization of this outright denial of climate change. But it's important for those of us to use our voices in the various ways we can to speak out. And I've certainly done that myself to the extent possible. I spoke a year ago. Tomorrow is the next Science March in Washington, D.C., and another cities around the world. A year ago was the first Science March, and I spoke at the Science March. I was at the front of the line marching with colleagues, and you're probably looking at that photo there, and you're saying, who's that guy next to Mike Mann? It is Bill Nye, the science guy, or to me, Bill, but Bill Nye, the science guy, and he has been lending his influence and his presence and his charisma and everything that he brings to the table to speak out about the war that is underway against science and against our environment. And it's important that we all find ways to use that voice, and I've done the best that I can. As I mentioned, I campaigned for Terry McAuliffe, and he ended up being, I believe, the first or second governor to announce that his state would still stay in Paris. Even if Trump pulls out, Virginia is still in, and a number of states followed suit. And that created the We Are Still In pledge from cities and states and people and institutions. And I remember talking to Terry about that, and he said, elections have consequences. And the fact that I sort of lent my voice to that campaign, I think also did lead him to recognize the importance of using his office to further progress on this issue. Now, McAuliffe was only beat Cuccinelli by less than 1%, or just over 1%. And they were hemorrhaging several percentage points a day because the election was right at the time of the fiasco with the Obamacare website. And that had become a dominating issue, and had the election taken place a few days later, McAuliffe might have lost. So he won by less than a percentage point. In their internal polling, they found that the specific issue of Ken Cuccinelli going after me and the University of Virginia, probably bought them several percentage points in the polls, because it turns out it wasn't just Democrats. There were a lot of Republicans in the state of Virginia who didn't like the idea of an attorney general going after Thomas Jefferson's University. That didn't play well with them. And so elections have consequences, and in this case, McAuliffe helped lead this effort by the states to weigh in and say, we don't care what Trump says, we're still in, and that created a larger movement. One person can make a difference, and that's true of everybody. The real danger right now, in my view, isn't outright denial of climate change. That is becoming marginalized. We're moving on because people can see the effect of climate change. It's no longer subtle. We see the impacts of climate change playing out on our television screens, in our newspaper headlines. The impacts of climate change are no longer subtle, and people can see them with their own two eyes. The real danger is this notion that it's too late to do something about it. If you really believe that there's nothing we can do, and there is a prominent spokesperson within the climate science community, sort of a folk hero to some, who has asserted, in fact, he goes around insisting that it's too late to do anything about it, that human beings and all life on Earth will be extinguished within 10 years, no matter what we do, because we've already gone past some tipping point. It would be one thing if there were a shred of scientific evidence to support that position, but there isn't. All of the evidence supports the fact that we can still prevent the most damaging impacts of climate change if we act now. So there is great urgency, but one of the threats to action is sort of gloom and doom and despair that potentially leads us down the same path of inaction. If you really don't think that there is any agency on our part in affecting change and acting on this problem, then it can lead you to the very same place that outright denial of the problem leads us. So we can't give in to that unjustifiable pessimism. I do have optimism, and as I said before, with what we've witnessed over the last month in the debate on gun control, we've seen this emergence of the voice of our youth, of millennials, but high school students. A voice we haven't heard too much from over the last decade and a half. And I think that younger folks have become restless. They recognize that their future is imperiled by the irresponsible decisions that are being made today by people in positions of authority. One of the more inspired things that the Parkland High School students have done is they have created an online petition, and they've asked parents to sign this petition where you promise to your child that you will not vote for a politician who doesn't support common sense gun law reform. These high school students can't yet vote. They're not in a position of influence yet in our politics, but they can influence other people who are in a position to act. And I think that was inspired, and I think that the way that these high school students have seized control of the larger narrative, despite the overwhelming special interests, well-funded special interests that oppose them, simply through the moral authority of their voices. To me, again, at the risk of repeating myself, that gives me optimism that we can tackle any problem, whether it's marriage equality or common sense gun law reform or climate change. We are going through a cultural tipping point right now, and we can go through a tipping point on climate change, but not without you folks continuing to push forward and to holding the adults in your lives accountable for acting in a way that does preserve the planet for you and your children and grandchildren. And so let me close by saying that the earth really does lie in the balance, and it's essential that we act now. There is an opportunity in less than 300 days. If we don't like the direction that we're going right now, if we don't like the congressional leadership and the way that they're not holding our chief executive accountable for acting on our behalf, we have an opportunity to change direction in this next election. And that's one of the most important ways that you can influence progress on this issue, is by showing up at the voting booth, or getting people to show up at the voting booth, or creating awareness that helps galvanize the public, getting them out to vote, getting them to contribute their voices. The voices of the people still matter. We've been reminded of that in recent weeks. The voices of the people still matter. And I ask you to use those voices to make sure that we act on this problem now. Thank you.
So thank you all very much. I know a few people may have to leave. We're going to stick around, and those people who want to ask some questions are welcome to do so. We've got one roving microphone here. We've got another roving microphone there. For the purpose of the videotape, if you could try to ask your question into a microphone, that will help you get it recorded, and we will take it from there. Does anybody, I guess, raise your hand if you've got a question? We've got one down in front right here, and I'm going to give this to you. Thank you.
How about that?
Since a lot of the greenhouse gas is manufactured to produce electricity, if we put millions of these windmills all over the planet, since we're taking direct energy out of the air, then can we reduce the severity of the storms that we've been feeling?
It's an interesting question, and in fact, people like Bill Gates have supported efforts at sort of this special type of geoengineering. Not all geoengineering schemes are necessarily harebrained. There are some ideas, for example, about how we can suck CO2 out of the atmosphere that deserve to be listened to and can help us act on this problem, basically preventing the genie from getting out of the bottle in the first place, or if we can't, getting it back into the bottle in this case. There are also efforts people have looked at, and again, with Bill Gates has funded efforts to look at ways that we could, for example, mix up the ocean mechanically to try to, there's cold water beneath the surface. If you can bring that to the surface, then that can dampen a growing hurricane or tropical cyclone. And there are ideas for how we might be able to do that. Mechanically speaking, being able to literally slow down a hurricane mechanically with wind turbines or something else is relatively unlikely, but there are some scientists who have nonetheless looked at ways we could set up arrays of windmills to capture the energy provided by these storms and to actually use that extra wind energy. It probably wouldn't dampen the storms very much, although there are natural impediments or obstacles in the environment that actually do help dampen hurricanes. Mangrove forests, because a mangrove forest isn't smooth, it's rough, and that roughness exerts more frictional influence on these storms when they make landfall. Part of why storms weaken when they make landfall is the frictional influence with the surface. Also, it's the cutoff of that supply of warm, moist air. But natural systems like mangrove forests do play that role, and that helps protect people in areas like Bangladesh from these landfalling storms. It's also a reminder of how the various ways that we are impacting our environment can combine sometimes in deleterious ways. As we destroy these mangrove forests, we're now removing that sort of, that line of protection that occurs naturally that helps insulate people from these storms. So mechanically speaking, it would be difficult for us through artificial structures to do that, but there are natural structures that help do that, and we're in the process of destroying them in some cases.
I was thinking over time, if we took enough energy out, we might sort of reduce it by a very slow method of getting that energy out of the atmosphere over time, but it would take time.
Yeah, the one other thing that I'll say there is it turns out that climate change to some extent is likely to slow down. The winds, the westerly winds that we typically experience here in the mid-latitudes are driven by the temperature contrast between the equator and the pole and the Arctic. And global warming actually decreases that temperature contrast. So in theory, it decreases the strength of those winds. But the interesting thing is you can get more intense storms. So the average wind speeds of the jet stream might slow down, but individual storms, which is where you see the most severe winds, could get stronger, and that would offset that effect. Thanks. Hello.
My question has to do with, you say that there is still time to reverse things. But Bill McKibben, didn't he say 350 parts per million? Aren't we up to 380 before it's irreversible? Like, how do how do those two go together?
Yeah, so there are different numbers that people put out there. My colleague James Hansen, former director of the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies, has been very prominent in advocating the idea that we actually have to not only stop CO2 levels from increasing, but we have to bring them down to the levels that existed in the mid-20th century, 350 parts per million, based on geological evidence that during time periods where CO2 levels have been higher than that sustained for long periods of time, we've seen massive sea level rise, we've seen the melting of the ice sheets. So it turns out it's somewhat a function of how long those CO2 levels stay sustained. And it's possible that we can exceed that level, but then bring it back down in time to avoid those very long-term changes, those long-term responses, the long-term melting of ice from occurring. That having been said, if you look, for example, at sort of the prevailing definition of dangerous interference with the climate, as I mentioned, the number 2 degrees Celsius warming relative to the pre-industrial is often held out. That corresponds roughly to a 450 parts per million CO2 level. So in the near term, at least, exceeding 450 parts per million has sort of been designated as the level that we don't want to go beyond. Maybe we can try to bring it down in the long term to 350 or lower. And it turns out we've exceeded 400. We're at about 410 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere now and climbing by about 3 parts per million per year. So if you do the math, that gets us to 450 ppm in a matter of a couple decades. I actually wrote an article in Scientific American a few years ago about that, about, within 2 decades, we'll be there if we don't act now. 450 parts per million, 2 degrees Celsius, is that the level of dangerous interference? If you're a low-lying island nation, that's way too high. They're already experiencing devastating floods and the potential literal sort of loss of their homes, of their homelands. And so there are a group of countries, low-lying Pacific Island nations in particular, that have advocated for a lower threshold, that 450 is too high, 2 degrees Celsius is too high. We need to keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. As we saw, if you're Puerto Rico, dangerous climate change has arrived. We don't need any more warming. Dangerous climate change has arrived. If you're Miami Beach, dangerous climate change has arrived. If you're Bangladesh or Tuvalu, dangerous climate change has arrived. So the point here being that dangerous climate change to some extent is any further warming, any further change in climate. We need to prevent as much continued warming as we can. And it's possible that if we can't make 350 ppm, if it's too late to keep it to 400 ppm, we don't give up. We still, I think of this, it's not a cliff that we go off of at 2 degrees Celsius or 450 parts per million or 350 parts per million. It's this steadily downtrending highway, and we may miss one exit. We may miss the 400 exit, the 1.5 degrees Celsius exit. That doesn't mean we give up. We still try to make the 2 degrees Celsius exit, and if we miss that exit, we still try to make the 2.5 degree Celsius exit. It's not a cliff that we walk off. It's much more like a minefield that we're walking out onto. And the farther we walk out onto that minefield, the more likely it is that we set off those explosions. Thank you.
Yeah, so my question basically is, well, there's no doubt that human impact is a great effect on climate change. What do you say to the things of like the inconvenient truth, how it said in 10 years we're gonna be dead, or like those great overcompensations, I guess, that some are said?
Yeah, so there are exaggerations, as I referred to earlier, people who have said that that we can no longer present, the extinction of the human species. And that sort of rhetoric, in my view, plays no role. There's no scientific evidence for it, and there is no utility to that sort of rhetoric in the first place. An inconvenient truth, as it turns out, much maligned, in part because the messenger was a political partisan. Al Gore was a Democrat, and that made it useful for those looking to sort of to politicize the issue, to make it seem like, to take somebody who is the figurehead of the Democratic Party and to say, look, we told you this is a political issue. It's not about science. It's just about partisan politics. So Al Gore was a very useful vehicle for those who have been looking to drive a partisan wedge into this issue for some time. I don't entirely hold him responsible for that. And I think he still accomplished quite a bit of good in getting this message out to a larger number of people. But the fact that he was a political partisan did make it possible to use him to further politicize this issue, because the critics understand that in modern American politics, you don't need to win the issue. You just need to divide the American public. If you can do that, then you can prevent any action from taking place, and they understood that. We actually litigated the science in An Inconvenient Truth. There's a website that I co-founded back in 2005 called realclimate.org. And if you go there, you'll find a couple articles where we actually went through the science as presented in the film. And what we found is that actually, pretty much got everything right. There were a few points where there maybe wasn't quite a bit nuance in talking about the relationship between CO2 and climate during the ice ages. There's some complications, and he simplified that. And you often have to simplify things for a general audience, and you can't launch into a 30-minute technical lecture on ice sheet dynamics. And so there were some simplifications that necessarily occurred. And in one place he had said that I think it was Tuvalu, he had said had been evacuated to New Zealand because of the encroachment of sea level rise. And in that case, he got the tense wrong. They haven't done that yet, but they have, in fact, made an agreement with New Zealand to be relocated when that happens, and that will happen. At this point, that's probably unavoidable. So largely got the science right in the case of An Inconvenient Truth. Al Gore and his Climate Reality Project has done a lot of great outreach, public outreach on climate change. They continue to be a great force for educating the public. But we do have to hold those responsible, those who engage in exaggeration to the point where it's damaging to the discourse over this issue. We have to call out sort of factual inaccuracy regardless of what side it falls out on. And I was criticized by some of my colleagues for taking to task. There was an article in New York Magazine about a year ago that the title of which was The Uninhabitable Earth. And it sort of did exaggerate some of the science to support this narrative. of, frankly, a doom and gloom type narrative. And I took the author to task for that, and that I was criticized by some colleagues who said you shouldn't do that. This was this was the most read article on climate change in modern history, and that's good, but we still have to make sure we get the facts right. Otherwise, we are vulnerable to the criticisms that we often make against our critics of distorting the science for partisan political ends. We can't do that. Yeah.
You just spoke about exaggeration, how people like to exaggerate. When it comes to solutions, I tend to see the exaggeration of the circumstances that are either good or bad, whether it's chemtrails or solar panels. Even creating the solar panels, it comes from a factory, uses energy, or even wind turbines creating different currents of airflow, So, or even the example you gave where we bring water from underneath to the top, that creates different water flow. I'm interested if there is a theoretical solution that doesn't exaggerate the negative, but in fact enhances the positive.
Yeah, I think that the solution is there. We know what it is. It's not magic. It's right in front of us. Wind, solar, geothermal. There are ways to meet growing global energy demand in a way that doesn't continue to damage the environment and to contribute to climate change. And there are peer-reviewed studies that have demonstrated that we can get there, that we can meet 100% of projected energy demand by scaling up existing technology that doesn't even take into account the inevitable technological process that arises as you start to deploy a technology. There's a lot of what we call learning by doing. You discover new efficiencies. You figure out ways to make that technology more efficient. So even without building that into the calculation, just taking existing technology today as it is, we can get there. Now, with the additional progress that will result if we invest massively in renewable energy and provide incentives to move in that direction, rather than what we're doing right now under the current Congress and the current administration, the incentives are precisely in the wrong direction. We're actually providing financial incentives to fossil fuel interests when the burning of fossil fuels is damaging our economy, our land, our water, our health, our national security status. That's a reversal from what it needs to be. There needs to be a price signal that incentivizes the development and deployment of those energy technologies that don't have that hidden cost of causing climate change. How to do that? Do we need a carbon tax, or do we provide subsidies for renewable energy? There are lots of different vehicles for doing that, and a good friend of mine who's a conservative Republican, Bob Inglis, he was a former congressman from South Carolina, had a nearly perfect lifetime conservative voting record. He's an evangelical Christian. He decided he had to actually use his position to try to speak out about the threat of climate change, which he saw as a threat to creation as a matter of stewardship. He was primaried out of his congressional seat, basically by the Koch brothers, and now he travels around the country lecturing to conservative audiences about how there are conservative approaches that we can use to solving this problem, like a revenue-neutral carbon tax. The idea is, if you don't like taxation, his principle is, we'll introduce a tax on that thing that, as he sees, we want less of, which is carbon, and from his political perspective, we can offset that by lowering income tax, for example. Now, there's a worthy political debate to be had about whether that's the right thing, the right way to go. I mean, that's a matter of politics, and that's what we should be debating. We can't pretend that the science of climate change is still debated, or that the need to act on it is still debated. Where there's a worthy debate to be had is in how we go about doing that. And again, one other reason for cautious optimism is the fact that we are seeing some conservatives who are coming to the table and saying, let's not go down the path of anti-science. Let's not deny the scientific evidence. Let's be at the table advocating for solutions that are consistent with our ideological principles. And I think that's worthwhile, and we need more of that in our Congress.
I hate cutting off the conversation because this is a great conversation. There is a book signing in the lobby, and for those of you who still have questions, I would encourage you to show up at the Stationery Factory tonight at 7 o'clock. It's totally unstructured, so you can ask all of your questions there. Just a quick word about the book signing. We have copies of the Madhouse Effect available. I do want to put in a plug for Michael's newest book. It's actually a children's book called The Tantrum That Saved the World. It's being published in England, and it was just out last month. So I'm very happy that I got my advance copy here. I'm happy to have you take a look at it if you're interested. It's available online. But why don't we move the conversation to the lobby? There should be juice and cookies. Feel free to stick around if you're able. And again, thank you so much for being here. Thank you to Dr. Mann.